Alright, so we've got a special mechanical project today. There's a little bit of hydraulics involved, but it's actually high pressure water. This is a large triple piston water pump designed to pump about 50 litres a minute at up to 5,000 psi for water pressure. It's going to need 32 kilowatts of power at maximum flow and pressure, which is about 42 horsepower. It's going to be mounted under the floor of a pancake truck, and it will be driven by a Powe Take-Off system, which is this unit here, which we are going to mount to the side of the manual transmission on the truck. So normally, these are what we call a PTO, Powe Take-Off unit. They bolt onto the side of the transmission. Normally a hydraulic pump will bolt onto here, but in this design, we're actually going to run a drive shaft to a pulley and shaft system, which will mount under the pump. We can't directly drive from the shaft to the pump because the angle is too steep. So we're going to actually have to have these pulleys, so the pump will be quite high, this shaft and this pulley will be below the pump so we can get the correct angle. So I'm going to introduce you to Seth. Seth will be doing most of the work. Come on in, Seth. So the initial project is we're going to go to the truck, we're going to drain the transmission oil, we're going to open up the inspection plate, clean up all the gasket material. These pumps actually come, these gearboxes actually come with a bunch of shims, so because we've got to get the right clearance between the teeth, but we'll discuss that as we move forward. So Seth will be doing most of the work. Say hello, Seth.
Hey!
All right, why don't you take and explain what you're going to do over at the truck, and I'll get on with the rest of my day.
Now that we're over at the truck, there's a few things we have to do before we start the job. It wouldn't help to go into the truck and find the manual and have a read and just make sure that you get to know all the parts that you're working with and all the components that we're going to have to remove. You also want to have a drip tray nearby, a few rags when it gets messy, and you want to have your socket set. It won't hurt to have some gloves either. So this is where the oil drain plug is here. It's going to need a socket and you're going to have to give it a good crack for it to come off, but it will come undone. Once you get it undone, you just want to let it come a little bit loose, and then you want to get your drip tray. You want to let that drain for at least 5 or 6 minutes before you start to dismantle your PTO plate. Once you've removed the plug from the gearbox, always want to just check and have a look to see if there's any metal shavings or discrepancies on the plug, just to ensure that you don't have any other further issues with your gearbox. You also want to make sure you measure your PTO flange, so when you take off the plate it lines up properly. That can be done with just a ruler or a tape measure. So next you want to crack all your bolts, preferably in a star shape, so from top diagonally to the other side of the flange, and then from down here to the other side of the flange, so diagonal like a cross. Before you take off the last bolt, whenever I do these, I usually give it a little tap with a mallet and just let it come off first, just so it doesn't kind of fall out and go everywhere. So once you take the last bolt out, it'll either come off easy like this, or the gasket will be quite stuck and you'll have to pry it off or use a little screwdriver to get in there and try and peel the whole plate off. So once this plate comes off, any remaining gasket sealant, you want to use a scraper or just a Stanley knife and lightly scrape any sealant off to make sure that when you put the new PTO on and the flanges and the seals, that it isn't going to leak. You only want to do it lightly. Flange surface, that we won't get any shavings and particles in there. Just lightly, don't want to push hard on the flange surface. Now we're just going to use this pad just to find a grit so it's not so rough on the flange surface. Once again, just going to lightly move across the flange. You're going to get a clean rag and some solvent. You can also use brake cleaner and just want to lightly spray over the surface just to get any leftover sealant or dirt on the flange. You just want to give it a nice wipe. And that includes inside, but be very, very careful when using your fingers and using your hands. But this surface is really, really sharp and you will cut your finger open. What you want to do is you want to get the supplied studs that came with the PTO, and you want to make sure that the thread goes in and that it's not the wrong bolt size. In this case, it's the right thread. Alright, can I pop now for a bit? So now that we're ready to start putting our studs into the gearbox, first we're going to find the short end of the stud, because that's what's going into the gearbox flange. What we're going to do today is get one of the nuts off one of the other studs and we're going to thread it on to the opposite side that's going into the gearbox flange. So we can get a spanner and we can put a bit of Loctite on and we can do it up and make sure it's locked in there nice and tight for when we want to put the flange on, when we want to put a PTO on. This on. Make sure it's the right stuff. Just a little drip of thread locker. You must have thread locker when you go to put the studs into the gearbox flange. Just let it run around the thread. just want to repeat this process. Now we're going to get a clean rag and wipe off any excess Loctite. Red locker. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to get our PTO and we're going to have 2 nuts on standby, and we're going to, in just a sec, we're going to slide this onto this flange and we're going to use this each opposite stud, and we're only going to gradually finger tight each nut, tighter and tighter on each side, and make sure that we have an even gap in between and that we're not just doing one nut up. You want to make sure when you go to slide this on that the gears align. It's quite simple, and you also have a little viewing port up the top, so make sure you have access so you can have a look and make sure that all the gears are lining up. Just put them on each corner. Tight. But you want to do them up roughly the same so that there isn't any big gaps. This has been evenly finger bolted on. You're going to get a feeler gauge like this one, and you're going to actually get your feelers, and you're going to each corner, preferably we're going to do each 4 corners, and here I've drawn a little photo of the flange, and each corner we get our feeler gauges, and we're going to slide them up into each corner, and we're going to write down how much interference we have in between each corner. So what you're going to do is you're just going to get your feeler gauges and make sure you've got a snug fit in between each corner. And when you get that measurement, you're going to write it down on the piece of paper. And I'll just do that step now. Now that we've found our 4 measurements from our feeler gauges, we're going to add them all together and get our answer. 0.96 one corner, 0.96 millimeters another corner, plus 2 millimeters on one corner and another 2 millimeters on the last corner, which makes our answer 5.92 millimeters. Then we're going to get that answer, and then we're going to divide it by 4, and that equals 1.48 millimeters. Then we're going to get our 1.48 millimeters, and we're going to plus 0.5 millimeters to it. .5 millimeters, and that gives our final answer to 1.98 millimeters. 1.98 millimeters. That is going to be our gasket size. So there's a few things we're going to make sure of before we put our PTO on. Here you'll have your gasket sealer gasket, and then you'll have your gasket shim. You want to make sure that your blue gasket sealers are on the face of the transmission, and that another one is on the face of the PTO, whereas your shims are in the center of these two blue ones. Then what we want to do is we give it a nice little coat of gasket sealant, just to double the protection and make sure there's no, just in case, just so we can guarantee there's going to be no oil leaking. Then what we're going to do is we're going to just carefully put on our first blue gasket sealer, and then we're going to put our shims that are in the middle on next. And here we've also made sure that our blue gasket sealer is on the outside, on the face. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a little drop of Loctite on each stud before we put the PTO on. Because we don't want the... We're going to very carefully lift it on. Line the holes up and slide it on like so. You should be able to get your finger in this little hole, guidance hole up the top. You should be able to get your finger in. And you should be able to hear just a little click. And that's the interference between the gear in the transmission and the gear in the PTO. Put it in the top corner, on the stud in the top corner. Just firmly with your finger, just do it up, and then you want to grab a nut on the bottom corner, across, diagonally. You want to do it up on the bottom corner like so. Now that that's done, you want to grab another nut, and you want to put it next to the top nut that you just put on. You just do it up finger tight. What you want to do before you even use a spanner is you want to make sure that you can still hear the clicking and the interference in between those gears, because if you are doing them up even with your fingers and it stops clicking and it goes tight, you immediately should take the nuts off, pull it out, and you need to put more packers in to push the actual PTO out so you get more interference between the gears. Because if you don't, you can have the gears break, the teeth can actually shatter, and you'll have to get a whole new PTO, or you might have to fix the gears in the gearbox. So we've got the right shims that we can still hear this click just by finger tightening these nuts up. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the rest of the nuts and we're just going to put them on the rest of the studs. Just with nuts are on every stud, finger tight. You want to get your finger, make sure you can still hear that click and that interference. It should be clicking quite loudly. You don't want too much, but just, you know. Anyway, what we're going to do now is, because we've got good interferences, we're going to get our spanner and we're just going to firmly do the top corner up. Just 2 half turns, and then we're going to go underneath and do 2 half turns. Then we're going to go back up on the other side of the top corner. We're going to just do it up half a turn, and then we're going to do up the bottom corner, up half a turn. It should go tight pretty quickly. Still got that interference. Make sure that that interference is there. If it goes tight, you're going too far and you're going to snap the gears, or you know, you can have all sorts of potential issues. So now that I'm happy that it's not that we've got enough clearance still, we're going to just nip up those 4 bolts, those 4 nuts up. Just nip them up. Don't tighten them up fully. We're now going to keep checking that. Every time you do a nut up, you want to keep checking that interference. But now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to doing these side of the rest of the studs. So you want to keep doing it crisscross. So every nut you do up, you want to do the opposite side to that. Just firmly. Half a turn. Keep checking that interference. So we're going to start nipping these bolts up now that we are very confident that these gears are aligned and there's a perfect amount of interference between the gear teeth. Only ever so slightly be less of a click. But that's perfect. You want to make sure you look at the manufacturer's specs, the PTO, and make sure that the backlash should only be between approximately 0.15 millimeters and 0.3 millimeters, which might be hard to see, but it's very, 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 very. You don't have to be. It doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as there isn't a massive amount of backlash in the teeth, and it's only just a small click, it shouldn't be an issue. Right, now that those are done up, you want to just leave your gasket sealant to dry. After you've done up all the bolts and nipped up all the bolts and made sure they're all tight, what you want to do is you want to get that cap that we took off from the top. Remember, you're going to have to fill up your transmission. So doesn't need much, just needs a little nip up. So it stops. Alright, stop there. If you've used gasket sealant on the gaskets, what you want to do is you want to let it dry for a couple of hours. And because if you put oil in straight away into the transmission, you could potentially have the gasket sealant not work and the oil will leak. So this needs to go back in. But first, what you want to do is you want to give it a wipe with a clean rag and make sure there isn't any metal or dirt on it. Make sure that O-ring is quite nice and not damaged. And you want to just pop that back on. transmission case gearbox.